When you imagine surviving a plane crash, you likely picture a pilot walking away from the wreckage with only a few scrapes and bruises. But in December of 1972, this was far from the case. A Uruguayan Air Force plane crashed into the side of a mountain in the Andes. It broke apart in midair and plummeted 300 feet into a narrow valley below. They discovered that the plane had landed in a remote part of the mountains, far from any towns or villages. Every night the temperature would drop to well below zero, and the survivors had to huddle together for warmth. They used the plane as seats and cushions to build makeshift shelters and tried to keep the fires burning throughout the night. They could either stay with the plane or abandon it and try to walk to safety. They decided to stay with the plane, believing that it was their best chance of survival. And it was a good decision because the plane provided them with shelter, food, and water, as well as a sense of security. The survivors were able to use the plane's seats and cushions to build makeshift shelters, which helped them to keep warm during the freezing cold nights. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to receive notifications. By subscribing, you'll be supporting us and helping us to continue sharing these amazing stories with the world. We appreciate your support and can't wait to bring you more incredible stories in the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. They also used the plane's wreckage to build a windbreak, which protected them from the strong winds that swept through the valley. The windbreak also helped to keep the fires burning throughout the night, which was essential for cooking food and boiling water. And perhaps most importantly, the plane gave the survivors a sense of security. They knew that the plane was there, even if it was damaged and useless, and that gave them the strength to keep going when all hope seemed lost. But the fires often died down, and the survivors had to spend the coldest hours shivering in the darkness. They were trapped in a remote and hostile environment, and they didn't know when or even if they would be rescued. If they had been stranded without water, they would not have been able to survive for more than a few days. And avalanches, all while dealing with the psychological stress of being trapped in the middle of nowhere. Their story is a testament to the human will to survive, as well as the importance of hope, determination, and luck. They were also lucky that the plane had some food on board when it crashed, which helped them to sustain themselves for several weeks. Perhaps most importantly, they were lucky that a search party eventually found them. If they had been left to die in the wilderness, they would not have survived. They had to deal with the stress of not knowing what the next day would bring, as well as the stress of trying to survive each day, but they did it. They supported each other and shared their fears and emotions, which helped them to cope with the stress. To make things worse, avalanches were common in the area, and the survivors had to flee to higher ground several times to escape being buried in snow. One time, a large avalanche hit the valley, killing one survivor and injuring several others. But miraculously, none of the bodies were recovered until weeks later when rescuers finally arrived. The nearest people were about 20 miles away, and they wouldn't be able to see or reach the survivors for days. They knew that they were on their own and that they would have to rely on themselves to stay alive. First, they had to find food and water. They found some water in the streams, but it was freezing cold and they had no way of warming it up. They also found some berries, which they ate despite not knowing if they were poisonous or not. But their best source of nutrition came from the plane itself. The survivors pried open the fuselage and salvaged what food they could find. They found some chocolate bars, biscuits, cakes, and canned meat, but it wasn't enough to go around. They rationed out the food, giving priority to the injured and weak. But as the days went by, the food ran out, and the survivors were forced to ration the remaining food even further. Several people were killed instantly, while others survived the impact but suffered serious injuries. The plane landed in an area known as El Plato, which was covered in snowdrifts up to 10 feet high. They kept a tally of the days on the plane's fuselage and waited patiently for rescue. But as the days turned into weeks, they began to lose hope. Many of them started to believe that they would never be found and that they were doomed to die in the Andes. But then something incredible happened. After 72 days, a search party finally found them. But how did they manage to survive for so long? The answer is a combination of luck, determination, and sheer willpower. The temperature was a bone-chilling -58 degrees Fahrenheit. Those who survived the initial impact huddled together for warmth, knowing that hypothermia was a very real threat. Soon others emerged from the wreckage, some disoriented and confused, while others lay motionless. They managed to gather the injured and dying near the tail of the plane where a fire was burning, hoping that its warmth would help keep everyone else alive. Sadly, it did not. By the end of the day, 29 people had died, leaving only 16 survivors. The impact was so violent that the fuselage split apart. It landed in a valley surrounded by 20,000-foot peaks, which was covered in snowdrifts up to 10 feet high. Of the 45 people on board, only 16 survived the initial crash. But their ordeal was far from over. They were stranded in the middle of winter in temperatures as low as -58 degrees Fahrenheit. Food, water, and medical supplies were scarce, and those who didn't succumb to hypothermia or avalanches slowly starved to death. This is the story of the miracle in the Andes. On the morning of October 13th, 1972, Flight 571 took off from Uruguay for a 2-hour flight to Chile. On board were 45 people, including 33 members of the Uruguayan Air Force, 12 regular passengers, and a crew of 10, as the plane flew through clouds and heavy rain. Turbulence shook the aircraft violently. At around 9:45 a.m., the pilots realized they were dangerously off course. They needed to make an emergency landing, but they couldn't get through to any of the nearby airports due to bad weather. So they turned back towards Uruguay, hoping to land at a military airbase in Montevideo, but the weather there was also terrible. Visibility was less than 1 mile, and the runway was covered in thick fog. The pilots decided to fly to a small airstrip in the town of Lescano, which was closer and had better weather. But as they approached the runway, visibility dropped even further, forcing them to turn back once more, and that's when disaster struck. At 10:25 a.m., the plane crashed into the side of a mountain in the Andes. As dawn broke over the Andes, the survivors knew they had to take action if they were going to survive. But it wasn't just hunger that they had to worry about. The weather was also a major problem. Despite all these hardships, the survivors refused to give up hope. When the plane first crashed, the survivors were faced with a terrible choice. The survivors also had to deal with a lot of psychological stress. And let's not forget the role of luck. The survivors were extremely lucky to have found a source of fresh water nearby. The survivors of Flight 571 are truly remarkable. They survived a horrific plane crash, starvation, freezing cold now. We'd like to ask you for a favor.